Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Who Cares? I'm very excited about this week's topic because it is a very interesting and important topic for a lot of people, and especially for criminal defense lawyers, as we will be talking about prisoners' lives and who cares about prisoners' lives. I know us defense lawyers, we do care. And we will be focusing in this episode on a very specific case, and that is the case of the late Soleiman Faqiri, who sadly died in prison and had an inquest where the jury found that his death was a homicide and where 57 recommendations were made. And I am joined by a panel of individuals who were involved in this case, so they know firsthand what happened in this case. I'll start with Yusuf Faqiri is my first guest, who is the brother of the late Soleiman Faqiri. I also have Lydia, Dobson, and Alexandria Bonney, who were representing they were co-counsel for the Tracking Injustice. Jennifer Chambers is the executive director for the Empowerment Council. And last but not least, Anita Szigeti, who was counsel for the Empowerment Council and the founder of Wicked, which is why we have this series. So thank you, everyone, for joining me today for this very important topic. And I will start with you, Yusuf. Um, if you can tell us about Soleiman Faqiri, who was he? And maybe if you can tell us about, like what he did, what he meant. Obviously, he's your brother, so he meant a lot as a brother, but what did he mean also to your environment, to the friends and the families that you knew, and the family that he left behind? So tell us a bit more about your late brother.
Thank you very much, Maya and the entire team for bringing me to share about Suleiman's story. I first want to just thank everyone for your time and folks that are listening. And it's fitting that the title of this session is called "Who Cares?" Who cares about Solomon's life? Well, not only was he a brother, not only was he a son, not only was he an uncle, he was someone who had a monumental effect and role in his family's life. There's so much to talk about Suleiman's life, on so many levels. But I'll start with this: is that more than anything, Sully was a human being that deserved compassion and dignity. He was uh, what he did for us as a family was that we come from a community that in many ways still struggles. We come from multiple communities, but I come from one of my identities is part of the Muslim community, and we struggle with the stigmatization of mental illness. And we're much better from years ago, but I want to start there in that, like, when Sully was diagnosed with schizophrenia, my mom took my entire family in a room, including my father, and said, "You're going to treat my son. You're going to treat my son for who he is, and that's my son." There wasn't this idea of like, oh, he has he has paranoid schizophrenia, or my mom made sure just right there she cut with that comment right there, she allowed Suleiman to thrive, in the 11 days that he would stay alive. He was diagnosed when he was 19. And so for me, by my mom starting that conversation, she forced us as a family to be transformed in terms of seeing Suleiman beyond his illness, right? And that changed everything. So, looking at Sully with that lens, just looking at him as like our brother, that illness existed and it was very difficult to navigate at times because the system wasn't very helpful. But if I look at that part, with that change, we're able to see Solomon more than just his illness, seen him as the academic, the athlete, my mother's son. He saw, and we're able to see Suleiman's gift being able to shine rather than like, oh my gosh, he has an illness. Is our life over? Because in our community, we are a product of our environment, all of us, right? And so, and I have this conversation nowadays as well. And so, when I look at Sully's life, um, he was a mentor to my brother Ali, my youngest brother. To my brother Swab, he taught him how to drive. he took care of my nephews and nieces. He was very close, especially to my nephew Musa. He named Musa. He taught actually my mom how to read Arabic, right? Solly was a gifted mind. In addition to his native tongue of Farsi, Solly spoke English and he learned Arabic. He was studying engineering at Waterloo when he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but he learned Arabic after his illness. And for me, he was even though I was the older brother, he taught me how to get closer to my faith, right? In the sense that I didn't know a lot about my faith, and I would have these conversations with my brother, and he was known to be a very wise young man. And so what ended up happening with Sully is that we did not look at Sully like, oh my God, he has this illness. He can't do anything. Sully was fully functional. We make this mistake, all of us, sometimes, whether subconscious, unconsciously, oh, you have an illness, it means as if your life is over. And that's a very, very, very horrible, difficult stigma to put onto people, and you might mean that subconsciously, but that's very difficult. And what that does with somebody who's suffering, they already need compassion already to begin with. You don't want to be able to ostracize them. And with that in mind, Sully ended up remaining that monumental figure in this family, to a point where many of us depended on him in so many ways. Like, my mom, as she was learning how to read Arabic, and when Sully used to give her lessons, he would literally spend hours with her, and they would spend hours together, best friends. Um, and when he was gone, it's been 7 years since his tragic death. Um, my mom's not been the same. My sister, who would spend, and with Sully would help, like, do errands for her. Nowadays she takes, she can't do certain errands because it reminds her of Sully. To this day, she hasn't visited his grave because it's hard for her to see, to relive those moments. Whereas with me, I take a longer route. I take a longer route in some streets in our hometown of Ajax, Pickering, because it reminds me of Soleiman. With my father, Solly helped him even after his diagnosis with his illness, helped him running my dad's business. He helped with the taxes, right? And so, um, and more than all of this, Soleiman had hopes and dreams. He was someone who wanted to be heard, who wanted to be seen, and who was seen by his mother and his parents, sorry, his father and his siblings. But it seemed the society, and within society, he was also being seen to a certain extent. But the practitioners in these systems never allowed him to be seen when he was sent in that institution for 11 days. It was the only time in those 11 years that we weren't able to get a hold of Suleiman. We as a family we were a very proactive family. We would do shift work, whether Sully would sleep in my room, and then my brother would go take care of stuff in the hospital. My mom would then, stay with him. And so all of that to say that Sully was someone that had this um, larger than life impact um, on all of us. And I can just go for hours. And even to this day, after everything that we've seen, we'll never be able to get over Suleiman. We'll never be able to forget who he was. Years may go by. That doesn't take away from us missing Sully. And I could talk for hours, but for the purpose of time, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Yusuf, for that. I mean, it's very important to remind us of who Solly was and what he did for those who had the opportunity to know him and for those who didn't know him. Um, but before I move on to one of the other speakers, I just wanted to ask a little bit, and I know it's a bit of a difficult subject to talk about. It's What was the experience when he was in prison?
What was the experience when he was in prison?
Yes.
Yeah, for anybody who's listening,
Mhm.
for anybody who's listening in this conversation, I know a lot of the audience, folks could be criminal defense lawyers or folks that are getting to criminal defense law, or folks that are interested in the area of mental health. We have to ask ourselves a very, very fundamentally dangerous question, but a very important one: is what we call a system when a loved one is suffering from mental illness, the family has to advocate for them. Why does the onus have to fall on the family to advocate for their loved one in a system that's supposed to technically take care of these people that are suffering from mental illness, right? And so, and then the question should be, why is the onus on these families? Imagine if some families don't have access to a car to go see their loved one. Because I'm going to get to your question, Maya. But we as a family, now imagine we as a family were a proactive family. My mom and dad, myself, and my brother Sora, we drove 4 times to that jail to see Sully. What if somebody who's a single income, First Nations or folks don't have that accessibility? Now imagine what the system does to them. But the system right now, even after Sully's tragic death, still forces the pressure on the families to go advocate for their loved ones. And that's the problem in itself, right? And so when we talk at prison, how it was like, I mean, let's talk about that here. We visited him 4 times, tried to visit him 4 times. Maya, we weren't able to see him once. We 3 days before his tragic end, myself and my father, we went to the courthouse to get him transferred to a hospital. To the credit of the JP, the Justice of the Peace, the judge ordered Solly to be transferred to a hospital, but he never made it. And it came out in the inquest. There was a comment that came out. It's like he's unfit to be he's too unfit to be unfit. That is to say that he couldn't even do his mental health assessment because he wasn't fit enough to do that mental health assessment. So the experience in that system was that archaic, not transparent, and operating away from scrutiny. So we weren't able to even see him, even though you have a family. And then my father in those 11 days, and this all came out in the inquest, my father was in those 11 days, went out of his way to go and give Solomon's medication to the system. And still, sure enough, it came out that they never received it. So the experience is that I will always say this, I've always said this publicly. It took my family 11 years to take care of Soleiman. It took the system 11 days for them to kill him. I always say this to people. I was like, if the guards killed my late brother, then the system was responsible for him on the path of being killed. And we heard of this story. It's like everybody operated in this. When I heard as information came out, they absolved responsibility throughout those 11 days, even though you have a family that advocated behind the scene. And the system still seemed to be indifferent. Indifferent, when this poor man who really needed help was forgotten about. So my experience with the system was nothing but a failure. And this is why I want, why we fought for all these years for this inquest, is that I hope that we're able to look at Sully's life and we say wait a minute, not only does something go wrong, but we have to work hard to make sure that something doesn't happen. That's why, and I'm sure Anita will probably talk about this later on, or some of the other folks, is that these recommendations need to really, really be reflected upon and implemented by the government of the day, right? And so, and this is so important. And I'll just add one part of one of the recommendations, Maya, and I'm sorry if you don't mind jumping in here,
problem,
is that inspectorate is so critical for it to be implemented. That's a life and death watchdog, in my opinion. But to be honest with you, our experience in the system was so difficult, and in the end, it was that experience or the lack thereof that ended up costing my late brother's life.
And just to be clear, you weren't allowed to see him, but you also couldn't talk to him, right? Like there were no phone calls or
nothing. We weren't able to see him, and I remember when in the 3 days before his death, when I testified in front of a judge and I argued that Sully needed help, and the nurse that also testified wasn't aware, and this also came on the inquest. They said we weren't aware if Sully speaks English or not.
Mm-hmm.
And
wow.
we have to ask ourselves, it's like, my brother was fluently bilingual in 3 languages. He came to, we were here in Canada most of our life. So this is something for us to think about, is that why do people with mental illness have to pay why does their life have to be paid with the price of their life for someone else, for the system's indifference? And in the end, that's Sully's tragedy. Imagine 4 times we were based in Ajax, Ontario. We drove to Lindsay. Lindsay's about 45 minutes north of Ajax. We drove physically. And for us as a family, we had the luxury to go. I call it the luxury to go and drive. And we still weren't able to see him. And now imagine someone who can't do that.
Yeah, and I mean that's also the other difficulty, right? Is that wherever the person is detained, the family has to make arrangements to be able to go and visit them in person, and sometimes that's really far from where the person's family lives. So I mean, it's really we're all obviously are very sorry for what you and your family had to go through, Yusuf, and we're really very grateful that you're sharing with us some of this, like this tragic experience, just to let us feel a little bit how it felt for you and your family. And I know it's a lot more difficult than what you're telling us, but at least we get a glimpse here of how it felt like. But I will now go to Jennifer to ask her about the Empowerment Council, who was also involved in this case. And my question for Jennifer will be, Jennifer, why did the Empowerment Council become involved in the inquest, and what were the areas of interest in the inquest for the Empowerment Council?
Well, I'd have to say that about this inquest, I was more outraged by the lack of criminal charges from Soleiman Faqiri's death than I've ever been at an inquest. And there are so many people involved, so many chances for it to have turned away from causing his death. And unlike many inquests, there's no point at which anyone could have said that they were fearing for their lives, no one other than Soleiman himself. So reading the facts of what happened to Soleiman Faqiri, and having recently advised and testified for Black at the Hassan inquest, also having been at the Ashley Smith inquest, I believe that the most important result of the inquest would be to bring an independent, rational, compassionate perspective to how prisoners are treated in the correctional system, especially prisoners with mental health issues. And equally important, because no advocate can be everywhere, it's my belief that there had to be individual ethical responsibility in the form of peer intervention. So if someone working in corrections saw another worker doing something harmful to another person, they had to do something about it. And this means healthcare workers as well as correctional officers. And it has to be reinforced as well, like on-the-job supervision, rewards and sanctions, protection from retribution. I had hoped that we could also address Islamophobia, as Sully's death combined with Abdurrahman Hassan's raises big questions for me about Islamophobia in the correctional system. Somebody referred to him as chanting and speaking another language as if it was some kind of evidence of something, risk, mental health problems. We were only succeeded in getting that addressed to a limited extent, referring to culturally safe and culturally competent services.
What about the expert witnesses that you contributed? If you can tell us a bit more about that.
Ruby Dunn did a great job of testifying about the options for mental health courts that could exist and that did exist in British Columbia, so that people weren't limited the way they are in Ontario to non-indictable offences. So right now it's only minor offences that can be diverted from the regular justice system. And clearly it's a miscarriage of justice for someone like Soleiman to be put into a system that in no way accommodates his needs. So we heard about how that could work. And we're also able to bring in, as part of the way that Ruby conducted her research, the idea that it was very important to hear from the people who are most affected when making recommendations for how a system should be developed and how the system should be changed. So including people with direct experience of correctional and mental health issues, racialized people, the people most likely to suffer from harsh treatment in the judicial system.
All right.
Also,
yeah,
I just want to say I also was very happy that Tracking Injustice brought Lindsay Jennings to the, oh, we got her last name right, I think that's right, to the witness box. She was great talking about her personal experience of having been in the system. She was very important to have heard from about the reality versus the policy in the system.
Thank you, Jennifer. I will now have a few questions for Lindsay and Alexandria. And what I would like both of you to talk a little bit about is, first of all, who is your client? If you can introduce your client to our audience and tell us who they are and what they do, and about the witnesses and the person with lived experience of incarceration. If you can touch a bit about on these topics.
Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead, Lydia, or?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So Tracking Injustice is an organization that tracks use of force and then death in custodies across Canada. And it's actually the only organization in Canada that does like a national analysis. And then using those data sets, Tracking Injustice will provide like the trends that they're seeing in deaths, demographics of individuals dying in custody, and factors that are present in those deaths. So spit hoods is one thing that we saw in this inquest that Tracking Injustice looks at. And so the team of Tracking Injustice is made up of academics, but also people with lived experience of incarceration. And because of that makeup, it really shapes the overall goals of its organization. So Tracking Injustice takes an abolitionist approach. So that means working towards a world free of carceral violence. And it also means centering the person, the individual, not seeing them as their crime, seeing them as a human being. And so Tracking Injustice really sought to be part of this inquest for two reasons. First, they did research around spit hoods and they really wanted to bring that forward. So as people who have watched the inquest will recall, a spit hood was used improperly on Mr. Faqiri. And since 2014, I think it is, Tracking Injustice identified at least 9 deaths where a spit hood was a factor. They can't say that that was the reason for the death, but it was involved. It was part of the series of events that occurred with a death in custody. So they really wanted to push for a total ban on spit hoods as the one reason. But then another reason, which is getting back to sort of the makeup and model of the organization, is they wanted to bring forward a perspective of lived experience. So that was Lindsay Jennings, who Lydia examined. And she has experienced incarceration, but she also works with people who are incarcerated now and is an amazing advocate. And she has done so much. She's been on the Chief's Coroners panel. She's done a lot of really important work. So she was able to really give the jury a sense of what Mr. Faqiri was going through, like the conditions, what the guards are like the psychological toll, the complete lack of resources, like really let them in on what he was experiencing, because I don't think any of the other witnesses was able to give that kind of information. And so Lindsay brought both the research from Tracking Justice forward, but also those personal experiences and really, spoke to the experience in general.
And if I may ask, how did you gather that information, especially the lived experiences? Like either one of you can answer, but I know you mentioned there's research, but for more details about how it is to be in these prisons, how do you gather that information?
Lydia?
Yeah, so Tracking Injustice as an organization works directly with families and with people who have that experience. And so they've taken on a number of different roles in working with families, either families who are also going through coroner's inquests as a result of losing their loved ones to violence in carceral institutions, or people who have experienced incarceration and have since been released, or people who are currently incarcerated and communicating with them. And in addition, as Alexandria said, a lot of the folks there have lived experience themselves, and so they're able to work with individuals in a way that appreciates exactly what they're going through. And so they collect this data qualitatively and quantitatively. So there's a lot of statistics that they have on deaths in custody and how those deaths are occurring. And then there's also, the qualitative interview-based research, doing workshops with families and consistently working alongside them.
Okay. And obviously, I mean, when you're hearing directly from people who were incarcerated, you're getting firsthand experience. So that's obviously very important feedback. But was it difficult to mention all these details in the inquest? Because, I mean, obviously they weren't nice details. And in the case of Mr. Faqiri, they were very tragic. So how is it? Like, how do you it is a difficult task to have to talk about that in front of a jury and in open court. So if you can maybe tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so Lydia and I both do a lot of work around prison abolition. We teach a class on the topic, so it's something that we're very versed in. So that when you're versed in something, that makes it a little bit easier, but it is an inherently difficult, very tragic topic, always. But anytime I work with anyone, like these are the stories. This isn't an anomaly. Like what happened to Mr. Faqiri, maybe it doesn't always result in death, but the tragic circumstances, every step leading up, we see time and time again. So for me, it was, yes, it's difficult, but this was such an important moment to bring that lived experience forward so people can actually see what it's like in prisons and jails, because it is, human rights are being violated every single day in every prison and jail across this country. It abhorrent conditions that nobody should live in, and people need to understand what's actually happening behind bars. And so Lindsay, it compared to what Lindsay did, like it was nothing for me to ask, for Lydia to ask her questions, like for Lindsay to be able to come forward and speak on her experience was so impactful and huge. And I think we all, appreciate her so much for doing that. It really gives you a true perspective of what it is like, because it's a horrible thing to be in jails and prison. It does not rehabilitate or reform in any way. It's just a punishment tool.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely. And I mean, it's, I don't think that anyone can really feel how it felt like more than the prisoners and the people who were living that experience. But I still wanted to ask here, like, I know that you've been selecting or gathering information from different prisons, but are there differences? Like, are there prisons, let's say, to put it that way, a bit better, where the conditions are a bit better than others, or is it bad and horrible everywhere?
I think I would say that there's differences. Like in some places, you'll get served frozen food, whereas in other places, it might have maggots on it. But they're not necessarily that much better. I think the one sort of notable difference is just between federal and provincial, because provincial correctional facilities are ones that have, a revolving door, because you're only in there for 2 years less a day. So in those places, there's not a lot of opportunities to organize for change, because folks just aren't there as long, and they have a lot less privileges than they do when they're in federal, because they're there for a lot longer. And so they can have some belongings, they can have access to different kinds of programming. But like we saw in this inquest, right, there's a lot of people who are coming in, they're not even having their first appearance, and already these tragic things are happening to them. And so, at least in federal, there's a bit more, a bit more, kind of having some stability and knowing what's going on, whereas provincial institutions kind of become a lot more insecure because there's such a revolving door.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Alexandria and Lydia. I will now turn to Anita, because Anita will be telling us about the recommendations. And I think hopefully this will help improve things. Hopefully they will be implemented and we'll see a change. So Anita, if you can tell us a little bit more about the recommendations that were made in this inquest.
Sure. But just before I do that, Maya, I never just answer a question straight up. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Alexandria and Lydia's contribution. And as Jennifer has said, Lindsay Jennings' contribution to this inquest is absolutely critically important to hear directly from a person with lived experience of incarceration. I think our jury benefited tremendously. And hats off to Alexandria and Lydia for the work that they do. They brought out the abolitionist in me, is always there, but I'd like to push the boundaries of that and abolish psychiatric detention as well, which also comes with a lot of problems. So for me, just in terms of what recommendations arise from this inquest, I can tell you how I sort of viewed what happened here and what the necessary recommendations were. As you know, Maya, I've devoted my entire sort of 3 decades long career to legal advocacy on behalf of people with serious mental health issues who are detained in psychiatric facilities. And although, the premise in this inquest was people who are seriously mentally unwell should be in a hospital, not in jail. And I think we can all accept one of the overriding principles enunciated in the recommendations is that people in mental health crises ought never to be in jails or prisons. They simply cannot be cared for there. I think that's a given. But just as a word of caution, I also want to be clear that on behalf of the Empowerment Council, instructed by Jennifer, but also for other organizations, I've participated in many, many inquests that look at deaths within psychiatric hospitals as well. So, there are some severe issues within those contexts as well. That said, I come from the world of psychiatric hospital detention, where there are patient advocates sort of established by law. When someone gets secluded in a psychiatric hospital, there is a patient advocate that is statutorily mandated, to be called. So in thinking about, Soleiman Faqiri was so fortunate to have this incredibly loving and supportive family who never abandoned him when he became diagnosed with a mental illness. My clients, a lot of them lose that engagement, that contact with their families. A lot of my clients don't have family support. So when people are in psychiatric hospitals, they do have access to independent advocates, even if they don't have family. If they get segregated or secluded, there are triggers that someone is made aware and comes to see them. And coming into this inquest, I hadn't personally been involved with a correctional death inquest in a long time. And I basically forgot that this system operates with no oversight. In our provincial jails, 2 years less a day, there is no oversight. There's no advocacy. And federal corrections has an independent oversight body that I think resulted from the Ashley Smith inquest. And there was supposed to be independent oversight where you could complain, someone who could come in and look at what's happening behind these many locked doors. But that legislation was never proclaimed into force. So Jennifer tells me that the Empowerment Council is a member of Tracking Injustice. I think I just see that. So I think I agree with Yusuf that probably the most important recommendation is the urgent need to establish independent oversight, this provincial correctional inspectorate that we called it. And the recommendation around that is extremely specific with respect to the powers that this oversight body, the inspectorate, would have. Because different models, this is an ombudsman-like model, but right now, if you are a prisoner who has a complaint about the conditions of your confinement, your only remedy is you have to ask correctional staff to give you a form to fill out that you then ask them to mail in the ordinary mail to the ombudsman. And you can just imagine the stack of things at the ombudsman's office and whether these things get processed and how useful that might be. If you're someone in jail and you're being abused, you're being beaten, you're not being fed, you're living in your own filth, it's not going to help you in any real sense to be able to complete that blue form and have it mailed off. That's not a remedy. You need to be able to complain in a meaningful way to somebody who is required to investigate that complaint, required to respond to that complaint, somebody who has the power to demand sworn responses, someone who has the power to investigate of their own motion if they see a systemic issue, a body that can come in when they want and look behind all the locked doors, a body that is obligated by statute to release their findings publicly, to put out a report so that we can find out what's happening in these jails, in these provincial correctional facilities. You know, as defense lawyers, you go in, you meet with your clients, you have some sense. But what about the rest of Ontarians? Well, I think what came out of this inquest came as a complete and devastating shock to most of Ontarians who can't imagine that we've got people detained in provincial correctional facilities that are treated not in a first world way, whether it's a person with mental health issues or any prisoner. And no one should be living under these conditions. And as we pointed out at the inquest, the only reason we found out what happened to Soleiman Faqiri is because he died. Had he not died, had he just been injured to the point of just shy of dying, we never would have known any of this stuff. So that inspectorate, I think, is critically important. Second,
well, just sorry, Anita, and well, in relation to this point, what would be important is to improve the prisoner's ability to communicate with the outside world, right? I mean, if we can't get to know what's happening at the moment, it will be too late to do anything, just like it was in this case.
Right. And that's and that I think, thinking of those who don't even have someone to call, like family or friends, and that's a significant percentage of prisoners. So thank goodness for Tracking Injustice. Thank goodness for prisoner advocacy. We heard from Lindsay Jennings that there's, you know, a form of peer advocacy. When people request peers with their own personal experience of prior incarceration, there may be some access to them, and I'm sure that that kind of thing is really helpful. But this does actually bring me to the next recommendation, which was for an independent advocate model, so that there would be an independent rights advisor and advocate within each institution, and that the rights advisor and advocate would facilitate communicating, because prisoners have rights, but nobody's obliged to really tell them about it, and there's certainly no oversight mechanism to ensure that their rights are being respected. So to have someone on the ground within each facility whose job it is to make sure that everybody's aware of the rights that they do have and assist them in exercising those rights. And those rights would include being able to communicate, being able to complain, having someone notified if you're isolated, if you're put into segregation, which is not meant to be happening, but if your conditions of confinement are increased. So I think having that independent advocate there, and as I say, we have this in the at least sort of former provincial psychiatric hospitals where unfit and not criminally responsible accused are held. And I can't imagine a world without advocacy and without sort of client voices, such as the Empowerment Council, for example. You know, just having access to advocates, being able to communicate what's happening to you to someone who will stand up and can independently advocate for you and stand up against the system. So that I thought was really important. Also, in addition to the mental health court stuff, I think Jennifer said Ruby Dehan spoke to us about a BC model. The model that I think she spoke about, where instead of the nature of the offense charged, it's the mental health needs of the accused that would screen them in as eligible to mental health diversion or into mental health court. I could be wrong, but I think it's a Nova Scotia model where it's a needs-based as opposed to an offense-based model. But I think access to mental health courts is important, albeit with caveats, because there are concerns. Ruby also spoke at the inquest about, it was actually Neha Chugg and Michelle O'Doherty who contributed a chapter to this book we're working on, where they talked about smaller jurisdictions that don't have formalized mental health courts that can support a mental health court proper, how to try and employ a sort of therapeutic approach, how to prioritize the mental health needs of accused and work in a more collaborative way to get them quicker assessments, quicker access to hospital, quicker access to treatment where appropriate. So she talked about that. But a sort of collateral part of that recommendation is something we don't talk about enough in criminal defense. There's these little known provisions in Ontario's Mental Health Act under Section 21 and Section 22 of the Mental Health Act that would allow any judge who has an accused in their courtroom, whether they're in custody or not, to undergo a comprehensive mental health assessment. And to me, the reason this is so important is because in Solommon's case, there were all these contrived efforts to get him a fitness assessment that didn't work, because the fitness assessment that was ordered, the initial one, was to be carried out virtually, and he wasn't well enough to participate virtually. And that's when he was deemed too unfit to be assessed as to whether or not he was unfit, which is ludicrous. But that's what happened. There are all these contrived mechanisms to, arrange an assessment of fitness to stand trial, because criminal court judges and criminal justice participants understand two kinds of assessments that may be ordered when someone has a mental health issue: fitness or criminal responsibility. Those are the assessments that everybody thinks. So criminal defense lawyers have a client who's obviously mentally unwell or in crisis. They start thinking, should I have my client assessed for fitness? Should I have them assessed for criminal responsibility? If your client is found unfit or not criminally responsible, both those things can have devastating, potentially lifelong consequences of indeterminate detention if you go down into the review board system. Much better if what you're a criminal court judge and all you want to know is what's happening with this individual. Do they have a serious mental health issue? Do they need treatment? Do they need hospitalization? What is their condition? What could help here? If that's what you're interested in and you're thinking like a therapeutic mental health court in that way, what you want is a general report of their diagnosis, their condition, their treatment needs. And you can get them into hospital for that assessment under the Mental Health Act, utilizing these two underutilized, unknown sections of the Provincial Mental Health Act. And why are they not in common use as they could be and should be? Because you could avoid these lifelong devastating detention consequences that sometimes result from fitness and NCR assessments. Why are they not used? Because hospitals don't have the resources, and the facility's consent is required for that order. So before a judge can make that order for that assessment and that report, a hospital has to say, yes, we'll accept the person for this purpose, or a doctor at least has to say, we will do this assessment. There have to be resources attached to that. So although it's a smallish recommendation among these 57, from my perspective, it's one of the most important ones, because if we designated special assessment beds under the Mental Health Act for this purpose, criminal court judges could get people into hospital for that assessment and get a more helpful, less damaging assessment, not at sentencing, but at the very, very beginning of the process. And that could have saved Solly's life. If he had been transferred for that type of assessment immediately, it may have saved his life. So to me, that's a very, very important recommendation. So those are the ones I would highlight: inspectorate, advocate, mental health court eligibility criteria switch to needs rather than offense-based, and special assessment beds and sufficient resources for Provincial Mental Health Act assessments. And Jennifer's already spoken to you about the peer intervention stuff, which already exists in the Code of Conduct for correctional staff, but they're not aware of it and they don't know how to intervene. So we recommended, and the jury adopted, sort of scenario-based mandatory training and refresher training to teach both healthcare and correctional staff how to intervene, because it doesn't come naturally to them. They fall in line. There's a hierarchy. Somebody ranked above them is telling them what to do. It doesn't come naturally for them to say, stop it, you're using excessive force, you're abusing your authority. It doesn't come naturally to them. They really need to practice that to empower them to be mindful of their personal responsibility to stop abuses. Now, they're aware that they have to report them after the fact, but it's like they, just sit there and watch, waiting to write it down. They have an affirmative obligation to stop it. So we spent a lot of time at the inquest on that, because I don't think that's happening. And it really, very effective way to stop harm.
Well, Anita, for those who are not very familiar with this area of the law, so once those recommendations are made, and if we want them to get implemented, so what is the process? Who is the body or the person responsible for actually putting this into place?
Yeah, very good question. So I think the short answer is no one, which I think is a disappointing answer for a lot of people. But there's lots of reason for optimism, because despite that they're not sort of self-enforcing recommendations, and there's no, their implementation is not mandated, people can't be in trouble if they don't follow or implement the recommendations. They can be in legal trouble. Despite that, my understanding is that the sort of implementation rate of recommendations coming out of Ontario's coroner's inquest is something like 70 to 80%. So the vast majority of recommendations, I understand, are ultimately implemented. I think the devil's in the details a bit about when an organization to whom recommendations are directed sort of checks the box that we've implemented this recommendation. Maybe they have and maybe they haven't. So it's up to parties to inquests and parties with public interest standing, like the Environment Council, Tracking Injustice. It's, I think, behooves all of us to keep an eye on the implementation process. We are informed about it. So maybe I misspoke. There is an affirmative obligation on everybody to whom recommendations are directed to respond to those recommendations, I think within 12 months. So I think in the coming year, the Office of the Chief Coroner makes sure that they send all the verdict and recommendations out to every government body and organization to whom recommendations are directed. And they have an affirmative obligation, a statutory obligation to respond. And then all the parties to the inquest get a report from the coroner's office with all those responses. And I'm not 100% sure if those responses are made public. They should be, and I bet that some inquest somewhere has made the recommendation that the responses must be made public. But it's up to all of us, not just the parties to this inquest, but it's up to all of us, I think, as Ontarians, as citizens, to utilize every avenue available to us to advocate for the implementation of every single one of these 57 recommendations. They are all practical, reasonable, sensible, goal-oriented, directly derived from the evidence we've heard in this inquest that could each and together all prevent future death in similar circumstances. And it's on us as a society, as Julian Roy, who's one of the inquest counsel, pointed out when he made submissions in support of the homicide manner of death in this case. You know, we are all responsible for this death and all these deaths, as long as we are allowing vulnerable people with serious mental health issues to be incarcerated in these terrible places with horrendous conditions, with nobody empowered to oversee and supervise compliance with human rights within these facilities. It is on all of us that Soleiman Faqiri died, and it is on all of us that people continue right now to be at risk of dying in these dire circumstances.
Well, and another follow-up question, Anita, in the case that, let's say, a recommendation was made and wasn't implemented and wasn't followed, and there was a situation that happened in the jail that could have been avoided if that recommendation was implemented, does that give any right in the courts to sue on the basis of that recommendation that should have been implemented?
Yeah. So I don't know, because I haven't touched a civil litigation file since 1994 and don't intend to try. So I don't know about lawsuit, but Jennifer's the person to talk to about the impact of these recommendations. And I suggest you ask her, because for sure, like at the next inquest, if someone died because of the ministry's failure to implement something that was already recommended in an earlier inquest, you can rest assured that they will be confronted with that in the next inquest. And you know, no doubt it's a basis for liability. I just don't know anything about that. But Jennifer, I think, would have something very important to say about how these recommendations and the prospect even of these recommendations practically influences change. So I suggest you talk to her about that.
Yes, and if Jennifer can maybe answer that question and tell us if there is any liability at all, if one of the recommendations was not implemented and the situation could have been avoided had it been implemented, are there any consequences? You're on mute.
I am muted. I cannot tell you about civil liability, but I did just finish writing part of a chapter that is overdue for Anita's book on inquests, and talking particularly about accountability in relation to the recommendations for inquests. And I think that organizations that know they're going to be back at an inquest, chances are good, like the police, at least the Toronto Police Service has become quite good about their accountability. They actually post online now a detailed response to inquest recommendations that have been directed at them. There is still a need, though, for community groups to be involved in how we define whether the recommendation has been implemented as intended, because even arguments about they had things listed as implemented, and we said, but that's not done. They said, no, we started it, though. I said, that's implementing. But when it comes to recommendations that are directed at governments, it's a lot harder to have transparent accountability because governments change, the staff move around, different staff get assigned to appear in court. So it's really hard to get someone to answer to the fact that if they had complied with the inquest recommendations that were made last time, that this person would be alive this time. I think corrections, being a little bit of a body in itself, might have more accountability, but we're going to have to see. And of course, a lot of what they can do is always limited by funding. If they don't fund a more advanced response to people with more serious charges, then we're not going to get it. If they don't fund better healthcare provision, that's not going to happen. So much depends on the government's ponying up.
Thank you, Jennifer. And now I will invite all of the guests to join, and just wanted to see if anyone has any final comment or point that they wanted to make. I give you this opportunity, all of you. I mean, anyone can say one last word before we conclude this interview.
I did want to add on that actually one of the recommendations of this inquest was to create a body that would be in charge of looking at how to implement and how to track implementation. So I really hope to see that recommendation be implemented, because that would be a way to address what we were actually just talking about. And maybe I could take this moment to just talk about spit hoods a bit more, and the recommendations around that. You know, we are, as I mentioned earlier, Tracking and Justice is really focused on that issue, and it came up a lot in the inquest. The Tracking and Justice was pushing for a full ban, and after our submissions, originally the coroner wasn't supporting that recommendation, but after our submissions, he agreed to support a review of spit hoods, and the jury did decide to make that a recommendation as well. But I just want to bring it up as just to reinforce like how important it is that we look at that and take that tool away from guards, because I can recognize that guards don't go into institutions wanting to do harm. In fact, often they probably want to go in like to help and stuff, but the institution itself creates a culture where the people that go in with a kind, compassionate mindset often come out like changed by the culture. You know, if you've seen the Stanford prison experiment, that is happening every day in every prison and jail in Canada. So we need to take, like, we know that spit hoods are, you know, we saw it here. They're misused in at least 3 different ways. How many times has that happened that we don't know about? It's also not health effective. Like having a piece of cloth, we all know now, doesn't prevent the spread of disease. You actually need medical devices. And just something I didn't talk about in my submissions, but I've been thinking of is, I can only imagine the fear of having a literal bag put over your head, you know, and not in an institution where you don't have any control over your rights and what you're doing. You have literally no power. Anita mentioned it earlier, prisoners have rights, but they don't know about them. So that kind of setting, and then you have a bag over your head that actually provides no effective like protection from disease. I think, and Tracking Injustice thinks, which is why we're here, that those should be removed, you know, and I just want to call for that again, because I don't want to have to be involved in another inquest where a spit hood was used. I truly think it's an abhorrent tool.
Can I quickly speak to that as well? And I 100% agree that whoever, I think it's Soljan who makes the decision, what are the use of force tools available in provincial corrections, they've got to get rid of the spit hood. There's absolutely no reason for it. In defense of it, one of our witnesses, I think, said, well, it's hardly ever used anyway because it's effectively useless. So, you know, what I can say is 30 years I've been working with people inside psychiatric facilities. And although there was some suggestion that they're available within them, and although I've seen 5-point restraints, all kinds of restraints, waist wrist restraints, I have never heard the word spit hood until this inquest. And I've been in seclusion rooms, I've been with people in acute distress. And psychiatric facilities, my experience has been manage any kind of behavior in the absence of this spit hood thing. It can only ever be terrifying. It can only ever be a massive risk factor for death. And we heard about the dangers of using them on people with mental health issues, but there are other ways to protect against, bodily fluids. And we heard about what those are, and we all know about face shields and goggles and whatever else, if there's a real concern of real close proximity. But under no circumstances should they be available so that they can be abused like this, so that Soleiman had it pulled over his head after he was pepper sprayed twice with nobody cleaning his eyes and his face and decontaminating him, and after putting the spit hood on him and throwing him on his stomach with his face down on the ground, handcuffing him in the back and restraining him so that he couldn't breathe, and he died. There's absolutely no reason to continue to have this thing available, which is only a risk and of no benefit. So I 100% support the calls to just burn them. They should just take them and burn them. Big bonfire of spit hood. We would all go.
I'm so sorry, Yusuf, that you've had to hear these horrible things that were done to your brother. And I'll just add about spit hoods that the alternative is not what happened to Abdurrahman Hassan, where a police officer held a towel over his mouth. And then he died. Also, with nurses present who did nothing whatsoever to help the person being abused. I'll just add what I mentioned in the chat, which is we're also a member of Tracking Injustice and a big fan of the project. Tracking Injustice also put out a fact sheet on people with the label of schizophrenia who died in judicial custody and mental health custody. And we talked about the possibility of taking on the very problematic concept of excited delirium, which is when people who are in custody who have mental health issues get blamed for their own deaths. Dr. Cameron actually made a brilliant statement about excited delirium during the inquest. I want to get the transcript of what he said, because he said to the witness, you understand this is in no way a medically recognized concept. There is such a thing as positional asphyxia, which I know that people are trained not to, in corrections and in the police force, not to do to people, which is exactly what happened to Soleiman. And that is something that's the responsibility of the people inflicting it, not the person's responsibility for having been in an agitated state of mind while placed in a position where they couldn't breathe.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And Yusuf, if you have...
I want to pick up, before I start, spit hood should be banned. There's no conversation beyond that. I want to pick up what everybody said, but specifically what Anita and Jennifer have said earlier too. For 7 years, my family has had to advocate, fight after my late brother's beating death. Now imagine the toll that this takes on a family. Okay, now imagine not everybody has the luxury to fight for 7 years. And so when Anita is talking and Jennifer's talking about these recommendations, we have to remember that the system cannot transform itself. The system is incapable of transforming itself. So when we're talking about that inspectorate, I want to go back to that inspectorate and that advocate, the prisoner advocate, is that this allows families, if they have to go through the I don't wish this to happen to anybody, but if they go through that tragedy, there's these foundational organizations that are there to help. And that watchdog, I want to come back to it, is that like 60 policy breaches on Soleiman's beating death, 50 bruises. Most of the guards who beat Soleiman Faqiri to death are still employees of the Ontario government. Okay, and so let's talk about these things here for a second. And the guards that beat my brother to death, there should be criminal charges. What Jennifer said earlier, who beat him to death. Police investigation. We've had to fight for 7 years, and there's still no charges. And so why does this happen? The reason this happened is because there isn't. The simple answer is there's this accountability mechanism that doesn't exist. That's why that inspectorate will go a long way, because these other organizations, and they do some important work, whether it's the Ontario Human Rights Commission or in the Office of the Ombudsman. And Anita's comment reminded me of one thing I wanted to add here, is that they do important work, but there's no legislative teeth. That's why this inspector is even more critical, because there'll be legislative teeth, because corrections also is known not to give data. I'm sure Alexandria and Lydia can talk to this. So they don't give data on how people pass away. So when we put up all of this, Solomon paid with his life. He paid with his life, and when I think about that, I know in one of the doctor's notes, it said that he was asking for his mother. Okay, and I have not shared this to my mom. I have not shared this with my mom. And I think about that moment, I was like, and I know if my mom was there that day, I know it would have made a difference in his life. But even after all that, all the people that failed him, and these individuals who killed him that day, they still have not been criminally accountable for their actions. So anybody who's listening to this, okay, to this conversation that's been, hats off to the folks that organized this, to Anita, to Jennifer, to Maya for bringing us here, is that we have to remember that people, when this happens to them, they pay with their life. And even with all of the information that's out there now about Soleiman Faqiri's death, the people that are responsible for his death are still not held accountable. And so I'm going to leave everybody with this message, is that Solly paid with his life. If anybody who's listening here, whatever you can do through Anita and Jennifer's leadership and Maya's leadership, we have to find a way for these recommendations to be implemented. I'm not interested in lip service. As somebody who knows the system in my regular profession, we have to remember that these tragedies will happen again. Right? A family should not be forced for 7 years to fight for their loved one. And on top of this, the people that killed my brother are still not held accountable. So I leave it with those, and I apologize for any pain that I'm articulating here. But this is my own flesh and blood. But I'm fighting in front of everybody here because I don't want someone's mom or someone's father or sister or brother to fight the way we fought. Because I don't want somebody to be buried and give it to their loved ones in a body bag. We fought not just for Soleiman. I want everybody to know, I always say this, I didn't just fight for my late brother. This system has to be transformed, and it's incapable of doing it itself. So we have to work with Empowerment Council and other organizations to work on these implementations, but especially those two recommendations, the inspectorate and the prisoner advocate. I leave it there. I don't want to overtalk out of respect for everyone, but I just want everybody to know of the profound pain that this family went through for 7 years. And that hasn't ended and will never end. So I'll leave it there. I hope mine made sense in some capacity.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. And I mean, hopefully, we know the price was very high that Solly had to pay, but hopefully his death is not in vain, and it will lead to better circumstances for everyone else from now on. So thank you so much for all of you for taking the time to chat with me today about this very important case and to shed some light as to this important issue. It's a very sad issue. I know we're the holiday seasons right now, which should be a very cheerful time, but this is a very heavy and important subject. But thank you for all your work on this case. And at least the good thing here is that the ultimate result was, in a way, what we all were hoping for. And on a more optimistic note, I like to always end on an optimistic note. I hope that at least some of the recommendations will be implemented, especially the ones that all of you highlighted as being the most important ones. So again, thank you so much for your time. This was a very interesting, very important conversation, and I can't thank you enough for everything you've done in this case. It was a really good job. So congratulations for your work and for your involvement in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be in touch, Yusuf.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.